In our last update, we explored how the health situation was again reshaping the experience of the Disney parks in the U.S. In this update, we'll analyze how the current wave of COVID continues to change the experiences at the parks and how it's likely to continue to do so in the months ahead. We also have some good news as it relates to the parks, but the central discussion in today's update focuses on films produced by Disney, how the changing health environment will also likely change the way that films are conceived, created, and distributed for years moving forward. Okay. You got your earbuds in? You got the cruise control set to a comfortable speed? You ready to sort out the strange times we live in? Here we go. When we left off in our last update, we were talking about additional pressure placed on Disney resorts in Florida and California to align with a CDC recommendation for indoor mask usage. Mayor Demings of Orange County, Florida, was again urging local businesses to institute an indoor mask requirement as he was unable to create a mandate at the county level. And the state of California was also recommending indoor mask usage for all regardless of vaccination status. Less than a day after our last update posted, Disney announced that masks would again be required starting Friday, July 30th, for all visitors in indoor space at its U.S. theme parks, hotels, and resort areas. Those requirements are now in place, essentially at all Disney venues across the U.S., from theme parks to Broadway theaters to cruise ships. Masks are required in indoor areas for all, regardless of vaccination status. There has been a lot of movement with mask rules at the parks over the past 3 months, so much so it can cause genuine confusion for typical guests. For a while, Disney World had different rules than Disneyland, which also had different rules than the announced sailings for the cruise line. At the moment, the set of mask rules align across multiple Disney experiences, so I expect this set of rules is unlikely to change for months moving forward, as through unity it will better instruct what guests can expect from a Disney experience in the U.S. But these rules come with both costs and benefits. The obvious benefit is that it should decrease community spread, and the hidden benefit is that the Disney parks may be perceived as a safer health alternative, particularly for families with younger children who cannot be vaccinated, and also for families traveling with older parents who, even though vaccinated, are still at an elevated risk. In this, Disney, at least in Florida, is courting a different market segment than Universal, where masks are only encouraged in indoor space and not required. And this requirement breaks down into 2 different demographics. Disney aligns with the needs and expectations of many families traveling to the resort from areas outside of Florida, and Universal aligns more with adults traveling without kids and locals. Obviously, there are large exceptions to both groups, but the 2 different sets of rules are also a type of marketing that will appeal to different segments of the population. I should point out that masks are still required at Universal Hollywood due to a county ordinance that requires masks for public indoor space for all businesses there. There's also a likely cost to mask requirement. In recent weeks, Florida has seen a high number of hotel cancellations, though it's unclear how strongly these cancellations are tied to new mask requirements at Disney and how strongly they are tied to news reports that 21% of all new COVID cases in the country are now in Florida, even though the state has just over 6% of the nation's population. In other words, the new case rate in Florida is now 3 times higher than that of the nation as a whole. Florida, in recent weeks, has seen higher new daily case rates than at any other point during the pandemic, including last winter, with August 5th bringing in nearly 23,000 new cases. In general, none of the health news from Florida this week is good. On Tuesday, the number of people hospitalized in Florida for COVID reached a record high of 11,515 cases, with over 2,000 of those in ICU beds. One center of the outbreak is again in the southern part of the state, in Dade and Broward counties, home to Miami and Fort Lauderdale. Another is at the northern end in Jacksonville. But the situation is worsening in Orange County, home to Disney World as well. In mid-June, Orange County had 52 COVID infections per 100,000 residents. In early August, that number grew to 511. 40% of hospital admissions in the Advent health system were related to COVID. Sequence sampling of those in ICU beds showed that the vast majority there were infected with the Delta variant. In wastewater samplings, Orange County has detected substantial increases in COVID levels in the past month, over 900%. Even with this, the Florida resort is still moving toward a larger opening, but a return to normal business practices partially depends on international tourism, particularly from Europe, which historically has been a significant market for Disney World. At the moment, in terms of tourism, the U.S. is closed to many countries. But this week, the Biden administration announced a plan to eventually allow more foreign visitors into the U.S., with the requirement that visitors are fully vaccinated. A spokesperson described this as, quote, a phased approach over time. That will mean that with very few exceptions, quote, foreign nationals traveling to the United States from all countries will need to be fully vaccinated. This is likely the first signal that the White House is seriously considering lifting some travel restrictions in upcoming months, assuming that levels of COVID decrease as we move through fall. This would be good news for the tourism industry, which has been particularly hard hit by the financial effects of the pandemic. But even though case rates present a worsening situation in Florida, there may be a type of positive news in this as well. In the UK, which had a midsummer spike also driven by the Delta variant, the new cases climbed very quickly, just as in Florida, but then they declined quickly as well. On July 20th, the UK, at the top of their Delta wave, had a 7-day average new case rate of 46,000, which 15 days later, on August 5th, was down to 25,000. If Florida follows this trend with Delta, it means that once the wave spikes, it might also quickly collapse by 40%, but again, this is simply extrapolating the wave pattern in the UK to project outcomes in the US. One significant variable here is the level of community vaccination. The UK has 73% of its population 18 and over vaccinated. 88% have received at least one shot. Those numbers are meaningfully higher than those in the U.S., which may affect how the wave prompted by the Delta variant moves through regions of the U.S. Though even with that, the Delta variant does seem to have a sharper decline than variants that have contributed to previous waves. In shifting to some better news, we speculated on the last episode that Disney was on the verge of announcing a type of annual pass program for Disneyland and also on the verge of offering annual passes to the general public at Disney World as well. Disneyland has now announced that it will open a new pass system on August 25th, which is months earlier than the timeline originally proposed in spring as the California resort reopened. In spring, Disney said that a new frequent visitors plan would be in place by the end of the year. The early date, August 25th, probably suggests that the demand for one-day tickets hasn't been as high as hoped, and that Disney will need to transition the resort back to a type of annual pass program to remain profitable, especially as the resort moves to the slow weekday period in fall. For all the discussion of a new type of pass system, the revamped Magic Key Pass program is remarkably similar to previous annual pass programs. In terms of similarity, the pass program has 4 tiers. The top tier has no blackout dates. The bottom tier, which, as before, is available only to Southern California residents, has many blackout dates, with available visits arranged between Monday and Thursday. The biggest difference is that all guests will require a reservation to enter a park. Florida regulars experienced this shift in the summer of 2020, shortly after the start of COVID. This change is now being absorbed into the Disneyland system. And for locals who were used to showing up at a park unannounced for a quick meal and a walk, this will represent a change. Previously, the resort had one pass that required reservations, the Flex Pass. With the Flex Pass, it was sometimes difficult to obtain reservations for a Saturday, but most other days remained open. The large unknown in terms of local pass holders is how far they will need to plan a visit before they show up at a park. It's safe to say that for most Wednesdays during the school year, you'll likely be able to reserve a park a day or two before visiting. But will you need to reserve a Saturday a month before visiting, or perhaps 2 months? The official terms and conditions read, quote, "It may be difficult for pass holders to get park reservations to visit on certain days or a select park." For Orange County locals who are used to on-demand access, this will be a big change. Though I think this change will be less disruptive for Southern California locals who live an hour or more from the resort and already tend to plan out their visits. The second big change concerns parking. Only top-tier passes include parking. The second-tier pass has a 50% discount on parking, and the two lower-tier passes have no parking discount at all, which at $25 a visit can add up. There are 4 levels, as I mentioned before. The highest is now called the Dream Key, priced at $1,399 per year, which has no blackout dates, but still requires reservations to visit a park. People with this pass can hold 6 reservations at a time. The Believe Key at $949 has blackout dates around the holiday periods, similar to the previous Signature Pass, and also blackout dates on some Saturdays during peak seasons. People with this pass can also hold 6 reservations at a time. The Enchantment Key at $649 has blackout dates around holiday periods, many Saturdays, a few Sundays, and most of the summer as well. People with this pass can hold 4 reservations at a time. And lastly, the Imagine Key at $399, which is only available to Southern California residents and is basically a midweek pass during non-holiday periods. People with this pass can only hold 2 reservations at a time. With the new annual pass system, it's clear that reservations will be a part of the Disney experience moving forward for pretty much everyone. Though Disneyland's main competitors such as Universal Studios, Knott's Berry Farm, and SeaWorld have shifted away from advanced reservations, Disney plans to use reservations for all visitors indefinitely. This allows managers to schedule the appropriate number of cast members, order the appropriate level of food, and manage other areas of variable expenses. In short, it reduces waste and increases profits. Beyond this, it ensures that annual pass holders only occupy a certain percentage of overall visitor spaces. From the standpoint of guests, it shifts the type of experiences that they are most likely to have at the Disney parks. With reservations, the parks encourage guests to plan experiences rather than to continue the type of drop-in culture that defined the California parks for the last decade, particularly on weekends. Florida pass holders already went through this transition last year. The price points in Florida in terms of face value are similar. $1,295 is the highest tier pass in Florida, but includes access to 4 parks, 2 water parks, plus other activities such as 9-hole golf at Oak Trail, the NBA experience, and the ESPN Wide World of Sports complex, as well as access to PhotoPass. That is, the price is the same, but the level of experience is larger in Florida. The higher price point for the California Pass is, in part, to limit the number of overall pass holders to better match available dates with anticipated demand. The big test for the new California system will be to see if users find a strong sense of satisfaction in it, in terms of availability for park reservations. Out in Florida last summer, Florida suspended new annual passes, though it allowed existing pass holders to renew. But the Florida resort has announced that it, too, in the coming weeks, will reopen their annual pass program with passes for the general public available before October 1st. The details on that, though, are still to follow. Now we're going to shift our sights to New York. On Tuesday, September 14th, Disney's The Lion King will return to Broadway after a year-and-a-half closure. And then on Tuesday, September 28th, Disney's Aladdin will return as well. Both reopening nights are presently sold out, though there's a lot of availability after that. But as tickets went on sale, both theaters announced new health policies similar to theaters throughout the Broadway district. This is the wording from the New Amsterdam Theater, presently home to Aladdin. They require, quote, proof of being fully vaccinated within at least 14 days of the show, and a requirement to wear a mask at all times inside of the theater, regardless of vaccination status. Children under 12 or people with a medical condition or closely held religious belief that prevents vaccination must provide proof of a negative COVID-19 test. In order to account for a fluid health situation, the theater is now allowing that, quote, tickets may be fully refunded, including all fees, or exchanged for another date up until 2 hours prior to the performance. Basically, they're saying if you're not feeling well, you can get refunded. Initially, in New York, some health policies were left up to individual businesses or business groups. Then this past Tuesday, Mayor Bill de Blasio announced that the city would unify requirements under a common program for many activities. For both customers and workers, the city will now require that all individuals present proof of vaccination for many indoor non-essential businesses. This will include live performance such as the Disney Broadway shows, but also extends to indoor dining, gym, bars, and other areas of entertainment. Quote, not everyone is going to agree with this. I understand that, de Blasio said, but for so many people, this is going to be a life-saving act that we are putting a mandate in place that is going to guarantee a much higher level of vaccination in this city. And that is the key to protecting people and the key to our recovery. The New York program will be both similar and different to programs announced recently in France and Italy. In France and Italy, a health pass will be required for individuals to engage in many indoor activities, with individuals showing proof of vaccination or a recent negative COVID test. In New York City, the health pass will only accept vaccination for entry into these locations. And by vaccination, New York requires a minimum of 1 shot. In Europe, the announcement of a health pass program led to a sharp increase in vaccination appointments, with millions seeking vaccination, and it also led to an open debate on personal freedoms. Mayor de Blasio, who has been reluctant to reinstitute mask requirements, sees vaccination as a possible way to eventually avoid government-required masking. Since the New York announcement, some other areas related to entertainment have also added vaccine requirements for workers and attendees. The 2022 Sundance Film Festival, for example, which begins in January, will now require proof of vaccination. And this brings us up to our main segment, the changing world of film. For decades, Hollywood gauged the success of big-budget films on box office sales during their first weekend. This was a reliable indicator that then forecasted out how a film would likely perform overall during its entire theatrical engagement. For films with reasonable reviews, the opening weekend box office would amount to between 25 and 35% of a film's total theatrical earnings. When a film had particularly bad reviews, let's say for Dark Phoenix from the summer of 2019, the opening weekend might represent a larger percentage as word gets out and then no one goes. 2 years ago, in July 2019, the biggest opening belonged to Disney's live-action remake of The Lion King. For its opening weekend, it pulled in $191 million. It was a well-received film, so the initial weekend represented 35% of its overall box office. At one time, the summer of 2021 looked like it might be the point at which audiences returned to theaters. Specifically, Labor Day was the quiet target date for studios to move beyond online or hybrid premieres and place all theatrical releases back on big screens. Last spring, as COVID numbers went down, studios committed to release dates for some of those expensive films they had been saving for months. But as those release dates approached, the level of health safety again began to diminish across the country, with the Delta variant surging in many states and with the CDC recommending that people in many counties, vaccinated and unvaccinated, mask in indoor areas. Theaters have struggled to return to any form of normalcy. Disney had 2 very expensive films come out to theaters in July, both of which were delayed from release dates originally slated for 2020. Both of which also premiered on the same day and date as paid premiere access on Disney+. The Jungle Cruise, a film that cost around $200 million to make, and over its opening weekend took in $34 million in domestic box office sales, another $24 million overseas, and around $30 million in Disney Plus Premier Access. Disney receives the entirety of the $30 million in Premier Access, but the box office take is split between theaters and the studio. These results would be disastrous using pre-pandemic math. But in terms of box office receipts, The Jungle Cruise is one of the highest-grossing films of the year. In terms of theatrical films premiering since the start of the pandemic in March 2020, Jungle Cruise holds the 5th highest opening weekend overall. Others have made more money on opening weekend, including F9 and A Quiet Place 2, another film that cost around $200 million to make. But at least as the Delta variant continues to expand, expensive studio films are simply not able to drive large audiences into theaters. The film with the highest opening was Black Widow, also released by Disney, bringing in over $80 million in its initial weekend. By the second week of August, Black Widow had grossed $359 million globally. In terms of COVID math, it's a hit. It's the largest grossing film in the past year and a half. In terms of profitability, however, it will likely never recoup its costs, especially when you add in promotional costs. Not only did Disney have the typical promotional cost to launch the film, it launched this film more than once. Typical promotional costs for a film like this are around $100 million. I'm guessing that this summer the studio scaled back on promotion based on the limited income potentials. But then there was that initial promotion with a price tag in the tens of millions back in the winter and spring 2020, which was a complete write-off. The longer the pandemic continues, the more likely it is that audience preferences will shift away from the big screen over to the small screen. In many ways, the heyday for chain multiplexes is likely over. There's a segment of the population who has simply grown accustomed to watching films at home and who, though they may return to physical theaters at some point in the future, will never frequent them as often as they did before March 2020. And this creates all kinds of problems for studios. How much has the box office potential changed for Hollywood films moving forward, even after COVID ends? And how will lower levels of revenue be arranged into the production costs for future films? And relatedly, is streaming the future center of meaningful and profitable Hollywood entertainment, particularly longer miniseries like The Mandalorian and Loki. In terms of fallout for this summer's films, there are some legal battles simmering over who is financially responsible for the losses and the change in release strategies. Black Widow, before the pandemic, certainly had the potential to become a $1 billion earner. After all, 9 previous Marvel releases, if you count in one of those Sony Spider-Man films, have topped $1 billion at the box office. Black Widow, as of August 8th, has been out for just under a month, with $174 million taken in at the domestic box office and another $185 million overseas. Disney, for the first time, released Disney Plus PVOD earnings for the opening weekend of its Premier Access release. On the Sunday after the film premiered at both theaters and on Disney Plus, Disney announced that Black Widow took in $60 million in Premier Access sales. This means, I'm guessing, that Disney felt that the numbers not only showed that Black Widow was a success, but also showed that as Disney Plus evolves, Premier Access can be a meaningful part of an overall release strategy. Black Widow took in about $80 million in its opening weekend on big screens, money that Disney splits with the theaters, but took in $60 million through Premier Access, all of which Disney keeps. The Premier Access sales were nearly all in the U.S., so in terms of domestic release money that goes back to Disney, Disney took in more money through Premier Access than it did through U.S. theaters during the film's first 2 weekend nights. Now here comes the tricky part. Theater owners who have deep investment and audiences returning to physical theaters claim that the $60 million in Premier Access wasn't new money, but rather money shifted from the on-demand market that typically opens at the end of a theatrical window. In other words, the people who would have rented the movie 2 months after it was released to screens instead simply gained access through Premier Access. But there's a hollowness to this argument as well, as I'm not convinced that those two things are the same. Disney didn't release subsequent Disney Plus earnings for Black Widow, but industry watchers who estimate online purchases reveal a story that Black Widow likely brought in far more than $60 million over its first 2 weeks. Samba TV, which has viewer tracking applications attached to some smart TVs, estimated that 1.1 million people in the U.S. purchased Black Widow during its opening weekend on Disney+. Samba doesn't track mobile devices or computers, which can also be used to stream Disney Plus content, so the Samba picture is limited, but likely large enough to be proportional to overall sales. They then reported that within their tracking sample, the overall number grew to 2 million during the film's second weekend. This adds an additional 80% to the original 1.1 tracked viewers. To apply that same increase to the announced Disney Plus sales of $60 million would suggest that the overall income derived from Premier Access during the film's first 2 weeks is around $108 million, give or take. Again, this is an estimate, based on a fairly large tracking sample extrapolated to those announced Disney financials. So the $108 million for the first 2-week period might not be exact, but it's fairly close. And if you've followed this so far, this again is where things get tricky. Attorneys for the star of Black Widow, Scarlett Johansson, on Thursday, July 24th, filed a lawsuit in Los Angeles Superior Court claiming that by changing the method of release, Disney damaged her ability to profit from back-end deals within her contract. A portion of her income from the film was tied to its box office performance. But by choosing to release the film on Disney Plus day and date with a theatrical release, an option that was utterly unthinkable before March 2020, Disney damaged her ability to make money as a significant number of potential viewers weren't seeing the film in theaters, but rather on Disney Plus. Though the film didn't take in Avengers-type money at the box office, Disney saw its stock price increase after it released initial income results from Premier Access. In other words, Johansson is claiming that Disney shifted the release strategy in such a way the studio would benefit both from direct sales and from an increased stock price at the cost of depressing the box office totals, which were tied to Johansson's back-end income participation for the film. Some level of disagreement over back-end revenue sharing was nearly inevitable. The star's revenue in Black Widow, similar to arrangements in many other films, was partially tied to benchmarks in terms of how the film performed at the box office. The lawyers overseeing the contract, when it was pinned years ago, didn't imagine that there might be a multi-year disruption to theatrical distribution due to a worldwide pandemic that would deeply affect how stars were paid. It was likely that some contracts, while studios used streaming services as part of their distribution model, wouldn't be successfully renegotiated in an executive suite. When HBO Max began to stream theatrical releases from Warner Brothers, the studio paid out millions in similar back-end participation arrangements. But surely some contract somewhere during the pandemic would likely end up in litigation, considering how new release strategies so deeply upend standard expectations for release plans. So up until this point, litigation should have been an expected outcome for some contract or contracts at some studios. But then things got messy, with overstatements related to the positions on both sides. The Wall Street Journal and others reported that the distribution shift would cost Johansson up to $50 million. The number of $50 million seems somewhat, if not significantly high, considering the lower potential of films during the pandemic. It was a number that was likely tied to a film with stellar reviews and released during optimal conditions. Neither of these things happened here. The film came out with an 80% fresh rating, which is good, but in the MCU, for the entirety of Phase 3, which includes 11 movies released between 2016 and 2019, only one film had a lower percentage rating than Black Widow, with many of them landing in the 90th percentile range. And then, of course, conditions for release were far from optimal. And comparing Disney Plus dollars to box office dollars is not a simple apple-to-apple comparison, which I suspect is the central legal dispute in the lawsuit. One of the most important details released about this dispute so far was released by a Disney lawyer. Quote, "We treated Disney Premier Access revenue like box office for the purposes of the bonus requirements in the contract." So why is this important? Well, if Disney added the Disney Plus money towards Johansson's box office target, it would increase, at least at some point, the money she made from the film. But this type of COVID math favors the studio over the talent. Again, this is where things get complicated. So at that 2-week mark, if Disney had added the estimated $108 million to the internal box office totals, it would increase the box office numbers towards higher thresholds that would have triggered various payments for Johansson. But Disney Plus dollars are not the same thing as box office dollars. Let me explain. We watched Black Widow at home. We, as a family of 4, paid $30. We can watch it as many times as we want without any further charge, though we only watched it once. If we saw it once in theaters on opening weekend, we would have likely paid about $50 for tickets. We also would have seen it only once. Out of the $30 we paid for Premier Access, Disney gets all $30. If we would have seen it at a theater, Disney would have had to split the $50 with the theater. Splits are complicated, with moving percentages, also with different percentage figures arranged during the pandemic. Typically, the studio gets more than the theater during opening weekend. But let's say that the studio would have received about $30 from the $50 we spent on tickets to see it on the big screen. Either way, from our family at least, Disney would have received $30. But for a Disney Plus sale, the studio adds $30 to the total of the revised box office for back-end revenue sharing. But for ticket sales, Disney adds $50. Let's say that our family is an average model. Sure, there are some couples who bought Black Widow on Premier Access, but there were also some larger families who also bought it, and also people who watched Black Widow more than once, and also might have done so in the theater. So let's say that an average Disney Plus purchase produces the equivalent of 4 ticket sales. The average AMC theater ticket nationwide right now is about $13.50, but children are lower. Again, let's say that overall 4 tickets would have cost $50. That's a 65% difference. If Disney Plus revenue were converted to a box office equivalency with these estimates, that would mean that Disney should have added not $60 million for its first weekend, but $100 million to create some type of parity. For our second weekend estimates of $108 million, that would equate to an equivalency of about $178 million. And that, I suspect, is the business center of this dispute. A few hours after the story hit the trades, a spokesperson from Disney fired back to reframe the disagreement more centered on COVID. And this is where things went wrong, because the statement presented the lawsuit in personal terms between Johansson and the studio, rather than as a financial or business disagreement. Quote, "There's no merit whatsoever to this filing," a representative at Disney said. "The lawsuit is especially sad and distressing in its callous disregard for the horrific and prolonged global effects of the COVID-19 pandemic." In industry circles, this response didn't play out very well. One trade quickly pointed out that in terms of effects stemming from COVID, Disney had, quote, laid off 32,000 workers. In another trade, the evolving story was again reframed as differences in management styles between the outgoing CEO Bob Iger, whose background is better tied to film and TV production, and Bob Chapek, the incoming CEO, whose background is better tied to consumer products. Industry columnist Sharon Waxman put it this way, quote, "My sources tell me that Iger and Chapek do not interact regularly." She then suggested that perhaps Iger simply let Chapek make this mistake as a way of highlighting the shortcomings of the new management team, which to me sounds unlikely. But this type of talk created a PR problem for Disney, also for Johansson, who may have had support inside the industry, but lost some support once general moviegoers learned that she had already been paid $20 million for the film, which is about 3 times the lifetime earnings of a primary care doctor. The back-end arrangement, according to media sources, was on top of her payment to appear in the film, a film that, at least before COVID, had the potential to take in about $1 billion. Variety had a very reasoned response by simply posing the question, quote, "Couldn't Disney's PR machine have written a more measured objection?" But even after this, longtime Disney attorney Daniel Petrocelli told Variety, quote, "It is obvious that this is a highly orchestrated PR campaign to achieve an outcome that is not obtainable in the lawsuit. No amount of public pressure can change or obscure the explicit contractual commitments. The written contract is clear as a bell. Studios generally control release dates without input from talent, but the reasonable expectations here were that the film would be shown in theaters exclusively, which would have increased the numbers that led to revenue targets for Johansson." On the same day that Petrocelli made a statement, Screen Actors Guild president Gabrielle Carteris took Johansson's side, saying that Disney should be, quote, "ashamed" concerning their earlier statement. Quote, "Scarlett Johansson is shining a white-hot spotlight on the improper shifts in compensation that companies are attempting to slip by talent as distribution models change. For some, including Carteris, Johansson has become a symbol of a woman standing up to a corporate structure over issues of pay. But by this time, the lawsuit was becoming a difficult situation for everyone. No one was backing down. In this, there were important issues of gender equality, current health conditions in the U.S., the responsibility of studios to talent beyond the letter of the contract, and the changing nature of film distribution. No one was winning. If anything, the affair would likely prove a deep incentive for many studios and stars to work out revised terms in a quiet meeting room far from the public's gaze. I imagine right now some discussions are happening about Shang-Chi to explore the contractual elements if that film were to end up also on Disney+. The lawsuit also places in jeopardy a Tower of Terror feature film that Johansson was set to produce for Disney, with a script written by Josh Cooley, whose most recent work for Disney includes story credits for Toy Story and Inside Out. The lawsuit also makes it less likely that Johansson would appear in subsequent MCU films, reprising her role in a sequel or flashback as Black Widow after appearing as that character for 9 films, many of them highly successful. But the big takeaway from this segment of our update is not the legal dispute between Johansson and Disney, but rather the shifting landscape for studios and theaters. At the start of the summer, it appeared that studios would work with theaters toward a gradual return to cinematic normalcy in the fall, with post-Labor Day films premiering only on big screens. Instead, studios are beginning to shuffle release dates and also to figure out alternate release strategies for other films. As I finish up this week's update, on Sunday, August 8th, the numbers are just now coming out for The Suicide Squad, a film that was expected to take in over $30 million at the domestic box office, with some industry experts forecasting over $40 million. Despite overall good reviews for this James Gunn film, it's at 92% on Rotten Tomatoes. It took in only $26 million at the U.S. box office. Overseas, it took in $35 million. The film cost $185 million to produce. Add into that tens of millions more for promotion. With this, I suspect, studios will be more gun-shy about releasing high-budget films as we move into the fall. Clifford the Big Red Dog from Paramount, originally set to release on September 17th, was just pulled from the schedule, though no new release date was given. It now joins other films such as Top Gun 2 that are being bumped back from 2021 to 2022. This past week, the most recent trailer for Venom 2 from Sony appeared without a release date. Instead, the trailer closes with a generic line, quote, "in theaters this fall." Though the film is officially on the books for September 24th, I think this end screen tells viewers all they need to know. Executives at all studios are watching the box office carefully and are having discussions yet again about how to reschedule expensive films for later dates. In terms of Disney, the company once had what appeared to be an ideal opportunity to compare financials from 2 Marvel movies, Black Widow, which was released in theaters and on Disney Plus on the same day, with Shang-Chi, which was, and still is at the moment, slotted for a release only in theaters. This would have defined, with reasonable clarity, how much Disney Premier Access contributed to or detracted from a film's financial potential as the world shifted towards something that resembled normal life. Only the world is not shifting in that direction at the moment. It's being pulled into a 4th wave of COVID. I expect that Disney is closely watching how theaters are faring in early August so they can decide if they need to bring Shang-Chi into a hybrid release, with it premiering as a PVOD title on their streaming service and also in theaters. To bring this section full circle, the situation with COVID, particularly in the U.S., is reaching levels where many aspects of studio business are again being rearranged due to a significant rise in COVID cases. September was the target date for many studios to return to in-person work. But already those plans have begun to fall apart. Sony Pictures Entertainment has moved the in-person target date for its workers from September 7th to a yet-to-be-specified date, perhaps in mid-October. But that date, of course, can be pushed back again if COVID numbers remain high. For months, many at Disney have been working from home, but earlier this summer, some returned or partially returned to the Burbank lot, though with sharp increases in COVID in LA, with daily infection levels already surpassing the previous wave, larger plans for workers to return to studios and to a sense of normalcy are clearly in question. In all of this, one of the bright spots for the Disney company continues to be Disney+. As such, the company is planning to expand content even into animation. After years of closing animation studios, including the one in Florida, Walt Disney Animation will soon open a new facility in Vancouver, Canada. One of their first projects in Canada will be an animated long-form series based on Moana. A long-form series is a mini-series like The Mandalorian or Loki that tells a story over many episodes, as opposed to the serial nature of most weekly TV shows. Story elements for the series will be developed at the Burbank studio, with production then handed over to Vancouver. The Moana series, the first presumably of many Disney Plus projects to be animated in this new location, is set to premiere in 2024. Even in terms of critical reception, Disney Plus is doing very well compared to theatrical output. Just take a look at these figures. In 2021, admittedly a wonky year, Disney received 15 Oscar nominations, far behind Netflix, which led with 35. But in the Emmys, now that Disney Plus is up and going, Disney clobbered the other studios with 146 nominations, the most of any studio, with the largest share, 71, going to shows on Disney Plus. The Mandalorian received 24 nominations, the highest of any show, an honor it shared with The Crown. WandaVision received 23. Beyond Disney Plus, the Disney company received nominations for shows on ABC, Hulu, FX, and so on. And in this, we continue to see how the pandemic is changing the world of Disney in films, in TV, and in theme parks and Broadway shows. I think most of the big changes for the fall have now been announced, and that many of the current health requirements, such as vaccinations to see shows in New York and masks for indoor areas at theme parks and on cruise ships, will be with us for months. I believe what we are seeing is that, even with a vaccine, we will experience wave patterns of infection for months moving forward, though hopefully these waves will diminish over time as more people are vaccinated around the world. I'm also hopeful that the COVID spike in Florida will soon plateau and that its drop will be nearly as sharp as it was in the UK, which hopefully leads to a better anniversary for Disney World as the Florida resort turns 50 in less than 2 months. I'll be back next Sunday with a new episode. As you probably know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. If you enjoyed these podcasts, if you find them a meaningful part of your week, please support us by becoming a monthly subscriber over on Bandcamp. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes. But the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link in the show notes. Until next time, this is Todd James Pierce.